Welcome to Marin TV. This is the third in an occasional series of special programs regarding the ongoing challenges faced by Pacifica Radio and KPFA in Berkeley. I'm Peter B. Collins, and like my guests and most viewers, I highly value KPFA as a critical media outlet in the Bay Area, providing an array of programs that give voice and views from people who are mostly locked out of the corporate media. KPFA and the Pacifica Foundation have a long history, and part of that history is internal struggle and dysfunction. As you will learn, Pacifica is on the brink of insolvency, or maybe past. In this program, we'll review recent events, including the well-known actions at WBAI, the Pacifica station in New York City. We'll offer two views, maybe more, of the situation, invite ideas on remedies, and discuss changes to the Pacifica bylaws to reorganize the foundation and reduce or eliminate the dysfunction while preserving 5 community radio stations that are very important to the people they serve. Before I introduce the panelists, a personal note. I'm a veteran of commercial radio and worked in Chicago and San Francisco as a DJ and talk show host. I'm a regular KPFA listener and have been a guest on various programs over the years. But I've never volunteered or worked for Pacifica. I'm aware of many people who are passionate supporters and that certain factions have developed over the years. I am not a member or aligned with any of those factions. And now, no matter what I do or say, some people will probably be unhappy with this program. Preserving and sustaining Pacifica is more important than how people feel about me. Let me welcome Peter Frank to our program today. He's an attorney, former president of the Pacifica Foundation, and a strong supporter of community radio. Hi, Peter.
Hi. Thanks for the introduction.
Also with us is Tracy Rosenberg. She's executive director of Media Alliance. She's the co-founder of Oakland Privacy, a former member of the local station board and the Pacifica National Board, and she runs the website Pacifica in Exile. Tracy, good to see you.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me.
Well, let me ask each of you to open with your overview of the current situation at Pacifica. We know that there's a $3.5 million loan that is coming due within the next year or so, and it appears that the foundation is running extremely low on cash, and this will lead into our discussion of what recently occurred at WBAI. Peter, why don't you go first?
Okay. We had a crisis in the year 1999 where forces that were Washington, D.C., centric in more ways than one, were taking over Pacifica. There was litigation, there was a big fight about that. We saw that there was no way for the members to have any say because there was a self-perpetuating board I was on for 11 years back in ancient history. So we won that fight by a hairbreadth, and we realized that Pacifica had to be democratized. Well, we way overshot. We created 5 boards at the 5 stations of 22 people each, and a national board of 22, or maybe sometimes it's 24. So we set up a system where we had governance by 132 board members. That doesn't work. We set up a system where there was no major delegation of power to an executive director or to top-level staff. We set up a system where there were checks and balances all over the place, but nobody could really do anything that rocked somebody's boat. There's another phrase I was thinking of. We have a 1947 model radio trying to communicate in 2020. It's like having a 1947 Model T try to do the freeways of this age. Pacifica has changed almost not at all since it was started by pacifists in 1947. Unlike other stations that we're familiar with, it hasn't adapted one little bit to social media. It's still based on linear transmission from one person with a mic to another. A little contrary to your view, this is a side point, but it's not totally a side point. Pacifica Broadcasting, what I hear, is a few hairs to the left of NPR. But I remember the days when WBAI sent Chris Koch to North Vietnam. Courageous, boundary-breaking thing. We are not doing things like that at all. We have a total stalemate in the system with overgovernance. Right now, listenership has been declining, income has been declining, spending has been declining much less. Administration is very poor. Tracy can give a lot more detail on that than I can. Debts have been run up. Magical thinking is happening. The contract with the Empire State Building, which resulted in a $3 million judgment against us, was not signed by anybody connected with WPFW. It was signed by the chair of the board. WBAI.
Yeah.
It was signed by the chair of the board of WPFW, a nice elderly gentleman.
Yes, Ambrose.
Ambrose Lane, yes. Who I have reason to think that there were some former Pacifica employees who knew how dangerous that lease was. They didn't do anything about it. Fundamentally, debts have increased. Administration is getting worse. Programming style hasn't changed with the times. It's a dinosaur, and there's a total paralysis at the top. I mean, it couldn't be worse than it is now with a board of 22 people split 11-11, and when one side doesn't like what they think the other side's going to do, they don't show up, so there's no quorum. There is no leadership. And it is so bad that I think Pacifica should be put into receivership. Nobody is able to make any of the decisions that the changing modern world requires, let alone deal with this looming $3 million debt that's going to come due in a matter of months.
So let's talk about receivership a little bit later in our conversation. But I wanted to give you an opportunity, because before we started taping, I mentioned that I was going to use the phrase I did, that Pacifica is on the brink of insolvency. And you said that may not be true.
I'm quite sure. Insolvency means your debts are more than your assets. Now, and the FCC does not allow you to mortgage or make liens of the value of the licenses. Put the licenses aside, the debts of Pacifica are much, take $3 million. The buildings are mortgaged. The debts are much higher than the assets. Tracy's shaking her head, and maybe she can correct me. One of the conditions of the loan, I'm quite sure, is solvency, as well as audited reports. None of those are happening.
And let's talk about that just for a moment, because there is this vicious cycle that Pacifica has failed to complete and submit audits for years. There's now intervention from an outside firm. Their effort to deliver a clean audit appears to be stalled, and this puts at risk the nonprofit status of the foundation, among other critical issues.
That's right, but I'll correct you on one thing. It's not an intervention. Pacifica did a smart thing in hiring an organization called NITA that's in the business of doing accounting and HR services for public broadcasters. But NITA hasn't been paid for 3 months, and is threatening to quit, and there'll be no accounting. So that loan could be called at any time, and there's no more money coming in. The bills are much greater than the cash. And
okay, and Peter, is there anything else you want to add to your overview? Because I want to give Tracy an opportunity here. Somebody whose opinion I highly respect said to me in an email a couple of days ago, people have thought that the Pacific is always in crisis, so it'll always be there. He said, it won't.
And it's the problem of the boy or the young person who cried wolf. I mean, we've been crying wolf for a long time. But this is far worse and far closer to disaster than Pacifica has ever been.
All right, thank you, Peter. Tracy, I'd like to ask you for your overview, and feel free to contrast your remarks with Peter's.
Sure. Well, there are both some high level and some sort of, I don't want to say low level, but sort of, factual things that I'd sort of like to amplify or comment on. So let me start with some fairly low level things, which are just things that I think are fairly factual that I want to clarify, and then I'll sort of move on to the kind of larger picture, because I think we all have an analysis of the larger picture, sort of the Uber Pacifica problem. But it's not true that the outsourced accounting firm NITA, whose contract is for $35,000 a month, has not been paid for months. They were paid $129,000 between June of 2019 and September of 2019, which is a 4-month period. And if you think about $129,000, that is a significant chunk. For example, a whole month-long KPFA fund drive generally raises about $450,000. So it's a significant chunk of money. So it's not correct to say that they aren't paid. It's also not correct to say that the audits aren't being done. The audit is sitting there. It is waiting for Pacifica National to pay an additional $25,000. And as I pointed out yesterday, Pacifica National didn't pay that money. It did pay some other things, like $30,000 in corporate travel in the last 3 months, instead of the audit. So there are some problems in terms of who's making these decisions, who's watching the store, because you can take junkets, but you don't want to lose your nonprofit license because you're taking junkets. And the question is sort of who made these choices is a pretty significant question that I have. And we've talked a bit about financial transparency. We were joking about it outside. We need some. It's a big deal. We don't know where all of the money is going. In terms of sort of the larger issues, Peter is correct when he says that these bylaws came into place as a result of what happened 20 years ago when when KPFA was locked down. We're going to screw up signal, the call letters, this entire program. But anyway, he's right about that. Those bylaws were written very specifically to make sure that a station could never be shut down once again by Pacifica National. Why is that a concern? Well, basically it's because of the nature of Pacifica National, because in and of itself, the parent corporation essentially has no income. It sits there kind of as an umbrella on top of 5 stations, which are making money and spending money. It's sitting there on something between 50 million and 100 million in assets, depending what you think the value of the licenses is, which goes up and down. It's probably trending downwards at this point. But $50 million is a whole lot of money.
But you can't really put that on the balance sheet because it's not collateral.
No, but you are sitting on top of it, and therefore it is tempting when people get tired of scrimping and saving, when they have things that they want to do that they can't do because the capital is just not there, they start thinking about what all of that money could do if it became kind of liquid. And that was the process in 1999, and I would argue it's probably a pretty similar process in 2019. But the reality is, in 1999, you could have gone to court, as WBAI did on this occasion, and you wouldn't have gotten anywhere because essentially the structure of the organization didn't prevent the parent unit from shutting down a station. In 2019, that's not the case. So these bylaws have done what they were supposed to fundamentally do, which was prevent the sale of these stations on the argument that they are community assets that belong to the signal area and to the people that have donated for all of these years. Now, there are things that the bylaws make difficult. I think organizational change is certainly one of them, and there are definitely changes that should be made. The nature and the scope of those changes is probably what we're going to talk about, but the reality is it's that central structure that made it possible for BAI to be preserved when it was attacked. And I don't think that's a minor thing, and I don't think we can throw that out with the bathwater. We were lucky in 1999 that we didn't lose KPFA. It was a narrow fight, as you said. Basically, the Attorney General Bill Lockyer had to do something that he certainly didn't have to do, that a lot of people thought that he wouldn't do.
The Department of Charities advised him not to do it.
Correct. So we were lucky that it happened, and in 2019, we didn't have to depend on luck, and I think that's a good deal. So let me stop there. There's a number of things to sort of say about, how Pacifica is handling broadcasting and how times are changing, but basically Peter's right that it hasn't shifted as quickly as it could or should, and there are things that need to happen to kind of make that easier. And it's also true that listenership numbers are not generally increasing, and listener revenues are not generally increasing, and that's a problem, because if you're not growing, eventually you're going to run into a cliff. However, insolvency does mean that your debts are greater than your assets, and Pacifica is nowhere near that condition. It owns $10 million in real estate. That's appraised. And the debts are well under $5 million. So the reality is it's cash flow poor. It's certainly being handled in what I would call a non-transparent and probably not particularly smart manner, but it's not actually insolvent or bankrupt.
Okay. Right now, I want to present...
Can I challenge one thing that Tracy said?
In a moment. I want people to hear the audio clip that we have, and I want to thank Carol Wolfley for sending it to us. And this is a recording of a brief portion of the Pacific National Board Finance Committee report from October. Let's listen.
In follow-up to the cash flow documents that were presented at the last meeting, I want to stress that the current cash flow situation is dire. Uniquely, WBAI continues to not be able to fund their payroll, health benefits, or central services. No other station has required this type of consistent help in meeting their basic operating needs. This is putting a severe strain on national office cash to the point that we no longer have any reserves, not even to cover the next payroll for national office itself, or Pacifica Radio Archives, which we also know is having an issue. We are dependent on receiving funds from the other stations to cover the remaining healthcare costs for October, vendor payments such as Primark, the pension administrator, Rogers and Company, the auditor, NEPA, which provides accounting and HR services, insurance fees, and attorney fees. National office has covered around $90,000 of payroll and health benefits for WBAI this fiscal year, and may do without $186,000 of central services to help with vendor payments. There's no way that we can continue to do this. WBAI's payroll and benefits come to about $60,000 per month. Central services payments due to P&O and P&R total about $20,000 a month from WBAI that are not being funded. A substantial amount of P&O expenses and management time are spent on WBAI legal issues and arranging emergency payroll funding. And WBAI's continued deficits are putting all of Pacifica at immediate risk because of using central services funds from other stations to cover their deficits instead of paying for services essential to Pacifica's financial survival. In addition, NEPA has had difficulty getting WBAI to conform to normal accounting practices, especially in regard to how vendor payments are made and how information should flow. If swift action is not taken, we will become behind on vendor payments and will begin to lose services. NEPA is now the longest owed vendor at 60 days past due and totaling about $60,000, with a new bill coming out today, making that total close to $90,000. Rogers is owed $26,000 and is about 40 days past due. There are several other smaller vendors who are surpassing the 30-day mark. Don Muscle, one of the engineers, has been waiting very patiently for about $25,000 for a long time. In the event that we're unable to maintain these payments to our audit firm, they will withhold our audit, which will prevent us from providing it to the California Attorney General's office, as is required to maintain our nonprofit status. This would be disastrous. As things are currently running, I don't see any room in the cash flow to keep current on vendor payments. If we're to prioritize keeping such vendors in place, then I'm not sure in good conscience we can keep WBAI staff working without being certain of our ability to pay for their time. And I also had an update on our current cash position as of today, which is that after funding payroll for P&O and Pacifica Radio Archives, We only have about $2,000 in the national account. We have about $150,000 worth of payables. We have $30,000 in insurance premiums that are due in October. And we've just found out the tower rent and studio rent for WBAI is past due in the amount of about $40,000. And just for information, WBAI's payroll that we need to cover for this particular pay period tomorrow is $23,000 that we don't currently have on hand. Those were the facts that I wanted to give out.
Thank you. That's Tamara Swiderski?
Swiderski.
Swiderski,
Yes.
okay.
Just to be clear, Ms. Swiderski, she's not really a CFO, but she's an accounting person. She's connected with the outsourced accounting firm NETA, so she isn't really a Pacifica employee, and she's been on the job for about 3 or 4 months, not a significant period.
Do you question
time.
her figures?
I don't entirely question her figures, but I believe that she left quite a bit out, just in
Like?
terms of context. Well, the interesting thing is, as dire as all of that sounds, the national office actually received a bequest from the WBAI area, some New York listener who died and left half her house to Pacifica. And that amount is $583,500. That came in July of 2019. It all went to the national office, every last bit of it. So this dire situation that's being described is 3 months after a $583,000 windfall. That was not expected.
And was it put into a separate account?
No.
The
It was-
$2,000 figure is...
It was not put into a separate account, and I have gone and looked at the accounting records, and over that 3-month period, $890,000 was spent, which is about twice the normal spending of the national office.
All right, Peter?
So I have well, let me just finish.
Okay.
So I think there's if not a transparency problem, there's an allocation problem, there's a prioritization problem. Because the reality is 3 months after, it was actually $683,000 because BAI gave them another $100,000, to be down to $2,000 in your bank account and to basically be over the moon over such small amounts of money that you're essentially saying that you're verging on collapse is a money management question. You know,
Well, there is a
it's-
cash flow issue. That's pretty clear from her report.
But there was a lot of cash that came in that was unexpected only a couple of months earlier, and how that was allocated and
Okay.
spent, and why there's no reserve of even $1 out of every $5 that came in is really a tangible question. And what I would sort of put out is, if $500,000, you know, falls on your head unexpectedly, and 3 months later you're broke, is that really insolvency, or is that just poor money management and maybe people not watching the store?
Peter?
I would say that's not driving. I would say that's a good example of what I was talking about earlier, that there's nobody at the helm. There's nobody at the top of the organization with the competence or the capability, and those are not the same thing, of watching what's going on and correcting things when they get off. The other thing that's built into what she said and is of great concern is that there has been a concerted campaign in the last few months of WBAI bashing. And you know, I would raise the question of why, and I have some ideas about why. You know, 7 or 8 years ago, Carol Spooner put out a letter saying we should have a friendly divorce, the stations would be better off without the overhead of Pacifica.
I know.
People, some of us consider that, people who really know were sure that most of the stations wouldn't survive in that situation, and we all moved away from that idea. But thinking about it, she was, and some of our discussion has been, WBAI as a thing by itself is all wrong. The strength of Pacifica is that it's a network. Call it a family. One child is ill, you don't shout at that child for being ill, you find a doctor and do something about the illness. The paralysis at the top made that not happen, and I think that at least some elements in some of the stations, and you sort of imply this, but I'll put it out, sort of salivated at the notion of several millions of dollars being available to maintain outmoded forms of broadcasting and large payrolls. And I will argue with you, Tracy, about Pacifica stopping the closing down of WBAI. It was WBAI staff. And
The bylaws is what I was trying to say is the bylaws were responsible for that, because what WBAI was able to enforce in court is the language that is in the bylaws.
Okay, but we're getting a little ahead of the narrative. Peter, let me ask you to hold on for a moment, because
I have one more thing to say about
I
that
want you-
financial report when
I
you're
want you
ready.
to wait for a minute, okay?
Okay.
Because we're getting ahead of the narrative, which is that on October 7th, the acting executive director, John Verneal, and Bill Crozier, who was a previous acting executive director and appeared on one of our panels by Skype from Houston a year and a half ago.
And is currently a director.
Okay. They went to WBAI without any notice and without any vote by the Pacifica National Board, and it appears that they took it upon themselves to lay off staff, to terminate local programming and plug in programs from KPFA and other stations in the network. And they also hired a corporate law firm that then, after a temporary restraining order was issued the following day on October the 8th, this company, Foster Garvey, the law firm, then tried a gambit to move it to federal court, claiming that because it's a federally licensed radio station, that was a canard, and that fell apart. And so ultimately, local control was returned under a court order, and it resumed on the 8th of November. So it was roughly a month that the local programming was interrupted. So was this driven by NETA and the financial report that we heard? And did Crozier and Verneal believe that they were in such a crisis that they had no choice, since they weren't going to be able to meet payroll, to make a draconian move?
Sure.
No, that's the wrong question.
Well,
Can I?
I'm asking the questions. You
Okay.
can answer them, okay? Go ahead, Tracy.
Can I? Okay. It's all right. If Peter wants to go first, I'm not going to, we don't need to arm wrestle. Do you want to answer it first?
I'll simply say one choice was to be worried about the payroll at WBAI. Another choice was to say the whole organization is spending too much on payroll, and to say that there should be a 10% cut in payroll overall. Now, that's one of the built-in structural problems with Pacifica. Half, or now, in my day, half, now it's 60% of the overhead is staff. If you have to cut your budget by 7.5%, let's say, which I think they got to cut by more than that, you have to cut 15% of your staff, and that creates a lot of turmoil. And that's one of the things that the structure of this of 132 board members has never been able to deal with. So yes, they could have been worried about WBAI. They could have been worried about Pacifica. There was no good reason for them to focus on WBAI just because there wasn't enough money right at that point to write the checks they needed to write.
Exactly. I mean, when I was trying to get in that last retort about Swiderski's financial report, part of what I wanted to say is that you can point to any of these 5 stations and give a really problematic financial
Report.
sort of analysis of what's wrong and how they're headed for the rocks. For example, the Washington station also hasn't paid Central Services for 2 years. But you didn't hear that in the report. The KPFK, the Los Angeles station, has had their fund drive receipts on a daily basis crevice by 67%, which is terrifying. KPFA's payroll, for better or worse, is now up to $2.2 million a year, which is about 67% of their entire revenue base, and that's problematic. So you could basically have that sort of a expose about any station, and you would come out of it saying, oh my God, something has to be done. That doesn't mean that WBAI is in good shape, but it also means that that particular focus, really none of the stations could stand up financially under that kind of scrutiny. So, okay, so WBAI. The thing that sort of is left out of that description is WBAI was 4 days into a fund drive. They were fundraising on air. They were bringing in the money to pay their bills. None of the Pacifica stations have any way to pay bills unless they get on the air and ask for money and people donate. That's where the money comes from. So running in and taking the wires out of the wall and firing all of the staff essentially set up a situation where there wasn't going to be any money coming in. There were just going to be newspaper headlines about the shutdown of WBAI and a whole bunch of people that were not going to donate because their programs weren't there. So in a sense, it created a short-term financial crevice.
Now,
That was made worse by the TRO, which said, well, you can't really just fire people with no notice. They have a labor contract. You can't do that. So then they got stuck paying the payroll with no donation. So the reality is the $60,000 problem, which, I believe the fund drive was raising $10,000 to $12,000 a day. So it would have been resolved in 3 to 4 days. In fact, they'd been in fund drive for 4 days, so they probably had raised $40,000 or so. So it would have been taken care of. It became a much larger problem.
So the guy who appears to have made these decisions is John Vernile, the active executive director.
Yes.
Does he have any serious background? I haven't heard of him, and I ask an open question. Is he qualified for the job?
Well, the premise of your question I don't think is correct.
Well,
It's not clear that John Vernile made the decision.
It is clear, yes. He has acknowledged that, Peter. He did.
Okay. But there was a strong faction of the Pacifica board that was backing him.
Well, it is not a majority of the Pacifica board, as several votes have demonstrated.
Right.
Yes, there was a faction that supported it. That was a portion of the board, but I believe they have all said that it was something that, and he has written long essays saying that it was something that he intended to do.
And he has been put on leave?
Well, Peter made a comment that there was nobody watching the store at the top when I was talking about all of the money stuff, which I still think is strange. And of course, that's not true. He's the guy at the top, or he certainly was. So, he was taking those actions, and maybe those actions were a little too focused on WBAI and not focused on a whole bunch of other stuff. I don't think that we would fight about that.
Okay, well, let me ask about this. I am a longtime member of
Yeah.
SAG-AFTRA. I served on the national board. And it shocks me that John Vernile didn't know there was a labor contract that prevented him from just laying people off without notice.
Anyone who is an executive director of a nonprofit with a labor contract should understand that you cannot do that. And the reality is you owe people under federal law vacation time and sick leave and severance pay that's in the contract that is actually more than the payroll.
Right.
So if anything, with this sort of instant termination, you up your liabilities in the short term, besides the fact that basically you can't do it. It's against the law, and SAG-AFTRA has already filed a protest, and they were going to go to arbitration, and all of that has been put to the side now because the staff have been restored by the court. But if this had gone forward, there would have been an arbitration and penalties and all kinds of things. So the question of what you were actually saving over this short-term panic over $50,000 that should have been in the bank anyway, if anybody was watching the store, because, like I said, after $500,000 drops on your head, maybe you save a little bit for the emergency, right? And they didn't.
Then the question is, what's going on here? And I come back to my theme of nobody's watching the store. Because the same thing happened in Los Angeles at KPFA 4 years ago when a new manager was put in and half the staff was fired with no regard to after or SAG contracts.
Well,
and so
there was a labor dispute about how it was done, but there was notice in that situation. But yes, Pacifica ran up about $250,000 in penalties. And again, they laid people off when they didn't have the money in the bank for the severance and the vacation and the overtime.
So nobody's really minding the store. Nobody is supervising these executive directors or these managers. And the organization is running up debts, doing poor radio, not growing with the times, and certainly not meeting the challenge of...
Well, in answer to Vernile's background, he was actually in commercial music. I believe he was a Sony person. So I don't know how much that prepares you to deal with nonprofit management or not, but he certainly was in the industry of broadcasting.
And how long has he been in his position?
Somebody help me.
5 or 6 months at the most.
I would say 5 months, yeah. So he
And I
acted
will-
very
I will repeat my comment I
boldly
made before the show that
for somebody new.
Pacifica has more interim and acting people than the Trump administration.
There's
Yes,
a reason,
and
there's a
you
reason
could-
for
and-
that.
well-
Let me say something about that. It's had, over the last 5 or 8 years, 15 or 16 executive director, interim executive directors.
not that many. That's over 20
14.
years.
All right, a large number, and they stay on the average of 6 to 9 months. And I believe, and I've been saying this for quite a while, that nobody competent to do the job would take the job under the circumstances that exists for the job. The executive director has very little authority. There's no protection from interference from this board member or that board member, or this board faction or that board faction. The executive directors haven't got the ability to get much done because of the structure of the organization, and I think that we really need to look at that.
Well, I just wanted to note a couple of other items here, and then I want to look at the path forward. The board accepted the court ruling, which ratified the changes and moves that they made at an October 20th board meeting that had
Yes.
been challenged. So Vice Chair of the National Board, Sabrina Jacobs, and Bill Crozier reportedly were removed. Does that jibe with what, because you seemed to suggest a minute ago that Crozier is still,
Sabrina has sent
Active.
emails today saying that she is still the vice chair of the board.
Yeah, but that's not what the court said.
That's true, it's not.
That's delusional.
And it's not, and I don't know what the truth is, but for Neil, some people say he's on a paid leave of absence. Some people say he's on the job acting. It's not at all clear
All right.
what his situation is.
okay, and before we move on from the WBAI episode, I want to note that Pete Dolak published a couple of articles at Counterpunch, and then Akio Tanaka, who serves on the LSB in Berkeley,
Yeah.
And has been on the PMB quite a bit.
he was secretary
1
of the
year.
National Board in 2017. He wrote a response, but the thrust of Dolak's articles is that there has been WBAI bashing, that it is the getting the blame for the dysfunction that really is endemic in the entire operation. Do you both agree with that? Is WBAI unfairly being tagged here? And is it because people see the idea of selling a station that performs weekly in the top market in the country in order to ease the problems in the rest of the network, to burn some of the furniture to keep the house
Right.
warm?
Short answer, I would say yes. And I think the evidence for that is simply that the piping in of programming to WBAI was never sort of a rational solution to the financial problems in any way, shape, or form. So the question of why are we doing all of this was never really satisfactorily answered. It wasn't to eternally pipe in California programming to New York City. So yes, I think that's correct.
Peter?
I agree. I think there's two things going on. There's a lot of BAI bashing, scapegoating, and some people in Pacifica, I think, had their eye on the value of that transmitter. BAI is right in the middle of the dial. So yes, that has been going on, and I keep coming back to this theme, and I think we should talk about it. There's been nobody with the power to do anything about it or even to call attention to it. The WBAI bashing has been almost endemic in the system because everybody wants to point to somebody else as causing the problem.
And there is that horrible contract, and while it wasn't BI's fault that it was signed in the first place with Empire State, it has certainly caused an organization-wide existential crisis because his money has to be paid back in 2021, and nobody knows where it's coming from. So people get angry about it, and look whose fault it is. It's their transmitter, and I think that, it's human, but it's also pretty unfair considering.
So Peter, earlier on, you acknowledged that the bylaws adopted after the crisis in 1999 were overly democratic. I think that's the way to put it, that too many people have the ability to say no. And it's hard to build consensus given the factional splits in the organization and its membership. So you have, once again, drafted some new bylaws for the organization. And as somebody who supports the notion of a listener-supported entity responsive to its listeners, I also believe that you have to have a management structure, and you have hammered away at this effectively, Peter, that it's a rudderless organization right now. So you're talking about a very considerable trimming of the architecture of the Pacifica Foundation. Could you take a minute or two and thumbnail that for us?
Okay. I'm talking about replacing the form of democracy with the reality of democracy and good governance. And I didn't write these new proposed bylaws. Just to be clear, a set of bylaws has been proposed, and 800 people have signed a petition, so they are ready to be voted on by the membership. They'll only come into being if a majority of the members vote for them. It was done by a group of us, myself, Bill Crozier, Donald Goldmacher, and Mansour Sabaga, who are current PMB members, former board members Sherry Gendelman, Carol Spooner, Akio Tanaka, who we've talked about, Carol Travis, former chair, and Susan De Silva. So it was a group process. They're not perfect. We voted on some provisions where we didn't agree. I lost some of those votes. I think that they could be better. But when you've got 32 people in governance, 1-year terms, that's very important. People are elected for 1 year, then that board selects a person to serve on the Pacifica National Board for 1 year. Then things change, alliances change, factions change, and personnel turns over. I was on the Pacifica board in a much simpler day, but still, Pacifica operates in a very complex regulatory environment. FCC, various state AGs, other aspects. It's a complicated organization. And I observed this a lot. It took new people on the Pacifica board a year to understand what was going on. So this constant turnover of people at the board level, and so we had the form of democracy. People voted. So what happened? Members got a colorful slate with nice pictures of some people, and another colorful slate, but I mean a postcard, large postcard, saying vote for us. What was said on those two sets of cards, was motherhood. If that's all you knew, you couldn't tell the difference. That was a form, I don't know if you want to even call it a form of democracy. It was not real democracy. What we are proposing is a structure whereby each station's members select one person onto the Pacifica board. And I think
And that's down from 4 currently.
Yes.
Right.
That's down from 4. And I think that if a community like this one has to find one person to represent it on the Pacifica board, we'll get a much higher quality of people running than we've had on these local boards. No disrespect to people who have been on local boards, such as one present. We also think that, and this is controversial, that the skill, I first came on the KPFA local advisory board because the manager told my roommate, Bill Sokol, that they needed a lawyer for the board. We need to round out the skill set. So we have proposed in these bylaws that there be 6 people at large appointed by the board after their first terms. And some people don't like this, but we've nominated 6 people. Heidi Bogosian, former executive director of the Lawyers Guild, Judy Gerbois, treasurer of several local Bay Area organizations, Bob King, retired former president of the UAW, and several other people at that level to fill out that board at the beginning. And we think that a board that has some flexibility of filling out its skill sets and its representation sets with these at-large seats is what's needed. And a small board can watch things and make decisions. It's not in these bylaws. I wanted to put it in, but I got outvoted. I also believe that the executive director needs to be granted very wide authority over the organization, protected from interference by the board, and have the ability to reach all the way down to the janitor if they want to change them. The Pacifica needs leadership and structure, and it needs to make changes like other public broadcasters have. And these bylaws that we've proposed, we think will do that. There's been objection to various aspects of them. There's been some distortion, but so 5 elected, one from each station, 6 appointed by the group after first-year terms is what we're suggesting.
And fundamentally, an uneven number is really wise.
Yes, yes. And
But let me ask about one other thing. In the current structure, a knowledgeable observer commented to me that the 3 members that come from listeners who are elected to the LSB, the local station board, that when they go to the national board, they are trying to promote and defend the interests of their station, as opposed to being, serving the entire organization nationwide. Does your new plan address that?
it does because of the 3-year terms. I saw this when I was on the board. People would come, they come from a station, they know KPFA or wherever they came from, but they start to see over time the problems of the other stations and start to build a loyalty to Pacifica as an institution. And that's what I would look for under this structure.
Mm-hmm. So let's get some comments. Tracy, what do you think about this?
Well, there's the kernel of some good ideas in the bylaws. I do think that, for example, board terms should be lengthened because it takes some period of time to figure out what you're doing, and sort of the board reshuffles every year, that it takes 3 or 4 months for people to figure out what's going on, then they've got 6 months, then it reshuffles again. Mm-hmm. That's not smart. That should be changed. However, when you look at sort of this structure, you basically have a hand-picked group of 6 people who were picked by that very small group of people that Peter mentioned, basically 8 people, who will be given essentially the majority of the entire Pacifica National Board. Pacifica has 47,000 members. 6 people will essentially decide the future of the organization. And the reality is that the accountability of these people, who they're accountable to, because they can't be removed or recalled or anything.
Yes, they can. They can be recalled and removed.
It's pretty difficult under the structure that you've set up, or that you've hypothetically set up. And the sort of the democratic remnants here is, okay, each station can have 1 person, but those 5 folks will be a minority on the board. So whatever the self-selected group, and they will be eternally self-selecting, meaning that those 6 will be replaced by 6 more and 6 more and 6 more. So that kernel of self-selected folks pretty much have a carte blanche.
No,
they can outvote the other 5. So the question here becomes, are you setting up a cartel? Are you setting up a junta? Is there an agenda here? And these 6 people, maybe not, but you're asking me to extend my trust and faith to these 6 people indefinitely in the future.
Well, Tracy,
and whoever,
you're
Peter, don't
misrepresenting-
interrupt.
Well, you're going on, and the premise of what
I
you're
am
saying is wrong.
telling
Okay, let her
you
finish
my
her point.
thoughts about the bylaws, and I'm saying that I'm being asked to extend that trust to the 6 people that those 6 people will pick, and the 6 people after them will pick, and so on into the future indefinitely. Why is this a problem? I mean, 20 years ago, it was a problem. We had an unelected board, and we had a shutdown at KPFA that we barely fought off. And in terms of extending the power of the ED, I mean, one minute I'm hearing, well, there's nobody at the top, there's nobody watching the store. At the other minute, I'm hearing, well, we need to have this super powerful executive director, but I'm looking at someone who marched into one of our stations and essentially turned it off with no authorization from the board. And I'm saying, and who was stopped only by a court order. And I'm saying, well, it seems to me like he has quite enough power, possibly too much, and that I'm not sure lack of check checks and balances is actually the problem here, because if we hadn't had that check and balance, New York would have lost their station.
Oh.
Okay.
Can
That's
we
the
talk
bottom
about
line.
the misrepresentation of these bylaws that you just stated?
Yeah, we can.
The bylaws name 6 people to the 6 at-large seats. They'll draw straws, or the electronic equivalent of that, to determine which are 1, 2, and 3-year seats. When those seats become vacant, the whole board, including the 5 elected from the stations, and the remaining at-large members, will fill that seat. So it's not like the 6 at-large will be self-perpetuating. And these are people from widely different backgrounds, highly respected in their field. I didn't want to take up the time to read all the bios, but you can see them in a few days on my website and some other websites. There's no reason to think, and I never heard of several of the people on this list before this process went on. There's no reason to think that they're a cabal that'll do X as opposed to Y that the list of people would do. We had to start somewhere and get some new faces, and this is the way we propose to do it. If somebody else wants to write different bylaws, get signatures, put them before the members for a vote, I'm all for that. But I want to accurately represent this. There's a strong amount of democracy, and there's a strong amount of bringing in talent and some balance in these new bylaws.
And Peter, what's the website where people can read your bylaws, or your group's
This is
drafted
a little bit of
bylaws?
self-promotion. I'm going to put them, there's a web page, and I don't have the URL. I'm going to put them on my own website, culturelaw.com,
Okay.
under other information.
All right.
And people can also email me, peter@culturelaw.com, for the link to more official places that they're posted.
And you have a petition online as well.
Yeah, the petition's online, but we needed 400 signatures. We got 800, so people could still sign it, but that requirement has been met.
Okay. Now, given what we've discussed and the scapegoating of WBAI, the feeling among members, particularly on the East Coast, that there are people on this coast who are gunning for WBAI, would these proposed bylaws coming from California people be well received across the membership of Pacifica, or would they be dead on arrival?
Well, we'll have to see, but I would certainly say that the folks in New York are not at this point in a sort of high trust position. They feel like they've been abused and betrayed, and a lot of this was supported by folks in California. So they're looking at them California bylaws as if it's an attack on them, and that is a perceptual problem for sure. I want to say 1 or 2 things here, which is these bylaws also, in some pretty fundamental ways, let this new board change the bylaws. So part of the problem is, are you going to get what you're voting for? Because I believe it's 30 days notice and a majority vote of the board to change the bylaws in most respects in this proposal, which is not to say the current process isn't a little bit labyrinthine, because it is. But if you go to the other extreme, 30 days and a majority vote, then you sort of have a situation where you don't quite know what you're voting for because it could change.
That's not where
and
we
it
are.
might change.
That's not where we are.
I think that's what it says, except for
If
some.
you give me a chance to say what it says, I'll tell you what it
Okay,
says.
let me finish my points, then we'll bounce back there. But I am concerned about the changing process, because you can agree on something, put people in power, then they can change it, then
You've
you've
already
got
said
something
that,
entirely
Tracy.
different than what you've ended up with. When it comes to Mary Frances Berry, I mean, I didn't know her, but I was a little shocked when I found out that my enemy, when I was, climbing up the banister into KPFA, was the former head of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. So I think the whole issue of these people would never do anything like that is something that we have to kind of not take too seriously, because people who you wouldn't think would do stuff like that have done stuff like that.
All right, Peter?
Tracy, you at great length talked about the amendment process. Any amendment to the bylaws that affects the rights of the members whatsoever, in terms of voting, number of seats on the board, and all that, has to be voted on by the membership. That's in the bylaws. It's also in California law. So your emphasis on they could change it easily, yes, they could change it if it didn't affect the rights of the members. And we did that partly on purpose, so to make it I actually wanted it to be easy for a few months or a year, and then harder, because 17 pages of bylaws. There's a lot of writing, and there's some cleanup that could be done. That was the reason for it. But Trace, there's no point in pushing paranoid theories. There's no paranoia. There's no scheme here. These people don't know each other. They've never met. They've made most of them made as a condition of being on this list. I'm not going to campaign for this. If you get it through, I'll be glad to serve. And that brings a kind of talent that we need.
All right. I want to, at this point, offer a statement from Carol Travis, who wanted to contribute to the program today. She said, if across the Pacifica network the programming was similar to KPFA, but with the cultural flavor of the city it was situated in, I think that would be great. Maybe a bit more national programming and one intersectional magazine show would be useful too. But a mix like KPFA gets my 2 thumbs up. However, Pacifica is ever on the verge of collapse, and that is more true today than ever. Either the organization will turn a corner and become fiscally aware and responsible, or Pacifica will be gone shortly. What I wish for Pacifica is that it had functioning governance structure that understood Pacifica as a multi-million-dollar progressive media platform, a precious treasure, uniquely corporate-free, with stations in 5 major media markets and 230 affiliated stations, plus radio archive material available nowhere else. Instead, we currently have a national board representing the 5 stations. It's not a Pacifica board. It's too big. The directors micromanage the media professionals who are hired, and the directors are not required to know or understand or even respect FCC regulations, the importance of paying bills, the importance of good programming. The experiment in ultra-democracy has failed. The 45 pages of detailed bylaws produce dysfunctional, toxic, factionalized, paralyzed, political playground, that's creative, of a handful of rotating, bitter naysayers. Finally, she says, what I want is a wonderful Pacifica station that I can turn on and off and don't have to think about its money or structure for 1 second.
Well, don't we all? But when it comes down to it, there are plenty of critiques that can be made of KPFA's programs. I know we all love our own stations, but the reality is that A, KPFA's programming in New York didn't work. They didn't like it. Nobody was interested. And the reality is that these are locally based stations, and they're supposed to be locally based stations. So the idea that 5 folks, some of whom don't even come from some of these signal areas, are the sort of the driving force of an organization really takes away the sort of local ownership and local connections that we are trying to have.
Peter,
so
I got to stop 20 seconds from you, and then the show's
all right.
over.
The notion that these 5 would be a unified group is just wrong. They're people who have a broad depth of experience. The other thing I'll say is that I mostly live in Los Angeles now. Most of what I hear on KPFK is retreats for better skin. Pacifica as a whole has a responsibility to improve its programming, and I'll say about KPFA, it's barely to the left of NPR.
And I must stop us there. The clock has run. Tracy Rosenberg, Peter Frank, thank you for a great discussion.
Thank you, Peter.